My name is Zhan Chiam. I work at ILGA as a Gender Identity and Gender Expression Program Officer. Together with Gate, we decided to put this on because we wanted to talk about gender identity in the context of gender more broadly. Partly because of the meeting yesterday at the Human Rights Council on gender integration in the work of the Human Rights Council, but also because we think it's an important lens, an important topic by which to view gender identity. So the question is, why gender? And basically, the issues that trans and gender nonconforming people face can all be looked at through the same prism as the gender perspective. So what are we talking about? We're talking about issues like access to employment. We're talking about gender and sexual-based violence, access to housing, education, the right to food, and then all the issues surrounding torture. So you're looking at honor crimes, FGM, forced sterilization, and then also the equal representation of trans and gender nonconforming people in spaces. So I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists before letting them speak, and then they'll be around for questions. So the first speaker is Kseniya Kirichenko, who is with ILGA working on treaty bodies and special procedures. She's also a Russian lawyer, and she came to ILGA from the Transgender Legal Defense Project, which does national and also international advocacy for transgender legal rights. Our second speaker is Eszter Kismodi, who wears many hats and has worn many hats. Eszter is now currently the advocacy director of CREA, and she's also an international human rights lawyer. And she has had a long history working in international spaces, including at the WHO as a legal advisor. Our third speaker is Sheriff Mothopeng, who is from Gender Dynamix in Cape Town in South Africa. Sheriff is their regional advocacy coordinator and also has a history of working on trans representation in film and media. And now Sheriff works on regional advocacy in the Southern African region. And finally, we have Mauro Cabral, who is the co-director of GATE. GATE is an international trans organization that does international advocacy and has focused on the ICD process, as well as trans movement building, which has led to the development of the International Trans Fund. So let's start off with Kseniya, who will talk a little bit about treaty bodies and its inclusion of gender identity and expression.
Well, thank you all for coming. And today I would like to share with you some results of the treaty body's work, analysis in relation to gender identity and gender expression issues, and its reflection in the treaty body's documents. This analysis is based on a research of treaty body's work for the last 3 years, that is 2014, 2015, and 8 months of this year. And here I would like to thank Helen Nola for doing deep research on the issue for 2014 and 2015, and invite you all to check out our reports on ILGA's website. Well, as we know, treaty body's main methods of work include concluding observations, that is country-specific recommendations, general recommendations that provide usually interpretation of specific provisions of relevant conventions, and individual communications on particular cases occurred in state parties. In my presentation, I will cover all 3 levels of treaty body's work in relation to gender identity, gender expression issues. And my analysis will be based on 7 treaty bodies, namely CESCOR, Human Rights Committee, CEDAW, Committee on the Rights of the Child, CAT, CRPD, and CERD. And let me start from the part related to concluding observations, probably the most exciting part in terms of taking into account the quantity of documents issued by the treaty bodies. The chart presents data for the whole period of 3 years, from 2014 till the present moment, as well as data divided by years. The blue columns show the whole number of country reviews for the relevant period. The red columns reflect the number of concluding observations that included LGBTI agenda somehow, and these recommendations include, for example, recommendations on intersex persons, or just for recommendations related to lesbian or gay people. That is, recommendations that do not cover gender identity or gender expression issues. The green columns demonstrate the number of reviews with recommendations mentioned specifically, either transgender or gender identity issues, and the last violet columns show the most interesting thing, namely the number of recommendations on particular experience of transgender persons. You can see that while treaty bodies pay more and more attention to LGBTI issues in general, specific challenges faced by transgender, not even seen by gender-nonconforming people, are still underrepresented. But let's come from quantity to quality. In those still occasional cases when the treaty bodies reflected particular experiences of transgender people, they highlighted such topics as abusive preconditions for legal gender recognition, coercive treatments, killings, and access to health. I think that many other themes still need more attention, and my colleagues could help with identifying them. The next question is language. Here we can see some progress, as treaty bodies have substituted outdated terms such as transsexual by more progressive terms such as transgender or gender identity. However, there is still a space for future developments, as gender non-conforming people or gender variant people should be included in the agenda. In this regard, I would highly recommend to look at the recent report by the Special Rapporteur on Water and Sanitation, who did an impressive work with language and terminology. Another gap in the treaty body's work is local identities, for example, Fa'afine in Samoa or Hijra in India. The treaty bodies could put challenges faced by these communities in a well-known boxes, such as legal gender recognition, for example, but it doesn't mean that the community's specific situation and local features are reflected enough. CEDAW used to address transgender women in its concluding observations, and here is another question for the activists. Should we reflect intersectional approach here and talk about particular situation of transgender women, or we want to look on this from a higher perspective, claiming that the problem is about strict roles assigned to men and women by society that affect transgender people from the whole spectrum? At least the last list of issues produced by CEDAW for Switzerland gives some hope, as CEDAW mentioned here transgender people, not only transgender women. Participation of civil society in the treaty body's work is another challenge. From one side, it is clear that treaty bodies need more comprehensive, deep reports on gender identity and gender expression. From another side, the 3 years analysis shows that even when activists produced reports, submit them to the committees and participate in the session, it doesn't guarantee inclusion of gender identity and gender expression in the recommendations. What could be reflected here is also experience of coalition work when transgender issues are included in broader LGBTI agenda, because you can have broad recommendation on LGBTI issues, for example, for hate crimes problems, but even though there will be no word on, for example, legal gender recognition. But let's come further and look at the general recommendations. For the last 3 years, treaty bodies issued a number of such documents. Some of them included gender identity issues and usually under broader LGBTI umbrella, and some of them did not even mention transgender issues. For example, in 2016, CEDAW produced a new general recommendation on rural women, and no gender identity perspective has been included in this document, while there are some particular challenges faced by transgender people. For instance, in many countries, many transgender people used to move from villages and small towns to big cities. But to obtain legal gender recognition, they still obliged to come, sometimes personally, to their hometowns, and it could present a serious risk. We as civil society activists can try to influence treaty bodies' work in this field by submitting our comments to new general recommendations. By the end of the week, for example, we can send our suggestions to CEDAW, who is updating general recommendation number 19 on gender-based violence. In the draft update published on the CEDAW website, LGBTI women are mentioned under the intersecting forms of discrimination. But don't we need a deeper approach? For example, naming specific forms of violence faced by transgender people, such as corrective rapes or coercive sterilization, or demonstrating how transgender person's situation affects their capacity to protect themselves against violence. And last but not least, individual complaints. While treaty bodies have already issued some decisions on sexual orientation, there has been no one on gender identity or gender expression. We can use here some regional experience as a model, for example, relying on the European Court of Human Rights decisions related to legal gender recognition. And we should think about the importance of this jurisprudence on the issue for the whole movement and for transgender people from such regions where no other mechanisms are available. Let's think about Asia. And some conclusions from this research, you can see them. The first important point is that gender identity and gender expression issues became more and more visible for treaty bodies' work. But usually they are covered under a broader framework of LGBTI issues. And developments in this field, in the field of gender identity and gender expression, are not so fast as on intersex issues. Because, for example, for the last 3 years, there were more and more numbers of specific recommendations related to specifically intersex people, but not for transgender people. I think that more interventions from civil society are required, describing what is the problems, what is the situation of transgender people in different regions. And we as activists should think about priorities for specific treaty bodies. For example, the Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination or the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, they used to implement intersectional approach, and they could be more open for dealing with gender identity issues, but they are still underrepresented in this term. We can think about specific issues that we want to uncover during this work, and as I mentioned, we can also think about using regional standards, for example, the standard of quick, transparent, and accessible procedure developed under the Council of Europe mechanisms, and we can use these recommendations, these standards, also on the UN level. So that's it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Kseniya. That's a really interesting overview of looking at the treaty bodies over the last 3 years. And I liked how you brought up the topic of the development of intersex advocacy at the UN space. And what Kseniya didn't say, of course, was that intersex advocates, I think, have been very careful in when to insert and when to separate from LGBTI arguments, and have had specific recommendations on specific human rights issues. And this is a question, I think, for the panel, and I think also for Eszter in her intervention. Where does gender identity and expression intersect with gender issues more broadly, and how might that be used as an intersectional approach as opposed to together with the LGBTI or LGBT approach? So on to Eszter Kismodi.
Thank you very much, and I really feel very honored and pleased to be invited to this panel, so thank you very much. And I don't have a formal presentation. I would like to raise some issues and thoughts that we are keep discussing in different audiences, but maybe a little bit from a different angle in such a forum. I would like to talk about beyond the treaty monitoring bodies and follow up on Kseniya's thought and talk about those UN agencies as well, or those UN spaces that primary mandate is not on human rights, and we didn't. There are other bodies, the Human Rights Council, the Special Procedures, OHCHR itself with their thematic reports, who are contributing to the development of human rights standards. But we shouldn't forget about those UN bodies whose primary mandate is not on human rights, but other development issues such UNDP, with broader development issues, UNFPA on population and development, now migration, taking the lead on many processes, WHO on health issues, UNAIDS on HIV. And I would like to use the angle for discussion, the HIV, the sexual and reproductive rights, and the gender equality angle for this discussion. Why is it important to talk about these spaces? Because these are very influential places in terms of programmatic development at country level. Very often these spaces are negotiations, the agreements and the policies are negotiations of member states that are directly being implemented at government level. So the different policies are influencing those policies and programs and the genders that are appearing or disappearing at the state level. So I think it's very important to take note that how trans people's human rights got recognition in relation to the HIV movement. And it's kind of being revitalized. And yesterday we had a session on HIV and the high-level panel. And I think it was very important what Mauro said, that we have to pay attention to the level of disconnection, if not hypocrisy, that is perpetuating human rights violations. For example, how legal gender recognition of trans people is disconnected as a human rights violation, and related human rights violations and barriers are disconnected from the HIV response. So these are two different angles, and and although we are talking about discrimination in healthcare settings in relation to HIV, how trans people, sex workers, those who are living with HIV are being discriminated, there is very little connection are being made that how legal gender recognition perpetuates to discrimination in healthcare settings for trans people in different manifestations in different settings. So when it comes to the gender framework and how much development has happened over the past 20 years, 30 years in terms of in the area of gender equality, gender-based discrimination, addressing gender-based violence, the analysis, the comprehensive analysis of gender and how gender belongs to every single person is very, it's almost completely absent in the work of the UN when it comes to influencing development processes and when it comes to political processes. And it's very little attention is being made that who the institutions are who are perpetuating this kind of absence. So how, and we can go to different processes. You mentioned CEDAW. But for example, there is the recent report of the working group on this elimination of discrimination of women in law and practice. And the recent report was on health and safety. It would have been an excellent opportunity to bring the gender angle into this discussion, since this report was focusing on instrumentalization of women's bodies and how gender-based discrimination is being reinforced by patriarchal norms and societal cultural practices. However, there is almost no mention of gender as a more comprehensive concept, and there is, as much as there is no mention how, for example, lesbian belongs to this gender analysis, there is no analysis how transgender people belongs to this analysis. There is a great analysis about how pathologization and unnecessary medicalization is a manifestation of gender-based discrimination and gender-based violence. There is no mention in the global agenda about how the exact same practice that is being recognized in relation to women, for example, mental health institutionalization because of sexual practices or sexual desires, the same forced mental health institutionalization is very most recently being recognized as a human rights violation in relation to transgender people for their recognition of legal gender identity. The third area what I would like to mention is the sexual and reproductive health and rights movement. There is amazing gains has been achieved in the past 20 years, and we are struggling still today on many, many issues, and many issues that has been achieved 20 years ago now being rediscussed as newly reoccurring problems. But there has been a great recognition of sexual and reproductive health and rights in the context of non-discrimination, in the context of choice, bodily autonomy, and integrity. Certain violations, like forced sterilization, because of population purposes, population control purposes, have been recognized as violations already 20 years ago. And also in relation to CEDAW has judgments in relation to, or decisions in relation to medical forced sterilization of certain ethnic populations. But it has been most recently recognized that forced sterilization of trans people is a human rights violation. It was in 2012 in WHO, in connection to the World Health Report on disability, when the issue of forced sterilization in relation to disability was raised, and WHO thought that it's really important to raise the issue in connection to disability. Then the sexual and reproductive rights people and experts in WHO, why don't you raise other forms of forced sterilization in relation to women's experiences? But then it was the question that what about transgender people? What about intersex people? It's a very same medical intervention then being applied for different purposes. So a pretty progressive interagency statement have been issued in 2014 as a collaboration of several UN agencies, but we don't hear so much about the implementation. And we talk about legal gender recognition and different processes. There is very little connection being made about the agreements 2 years ago as a great recognition that forced sterilization is a human rights violation. Another issue is that how sexuality and gender expression and gender identity is being mixed, not only in terms of development processes, but in judgments, in court decisions, in reports, because there is so little and limited understanding about the connections and the disconnections, and the human rights analysis of that. And 2 small points on that. The remaining disconnection, for example, and I mentioned it yesterday, but I feel that it's very important to mention from a very different perspective, that UN Women has a call now to develop a position statement on sex work. They are calling for submissions, and the title is in relation to sex work, sex trade, and prostitution. So the framing is already suggests a certain kind of framework. However, the 3 questions what UN Women are posing has some connection to human rights and gender equality, but framed only in the SDGs, that how the different SDG targets related to sex work, sex trade, and prostitution. But the last question is asking about how sex trade is gendered, how best we can protect women in the trade from harm, violence, stigma, and discrimination. It's very clear that although it has been recognized and being recognized that in sex work and sex workers' human rights, as rights holders are women, but also men, boys, girls, transgender people, this kind of framing provides very limited framing of a comprehensive understanding of gender within the context of sex work. One of my 2 last points is that there is a buzzword in the human rights world now about intersectionality. And in whatever panel, discussion, report we are going, intersectionality is being applied. But it's a very little analysis in the human rights work that is applying intersectionality in relation to gender identity and gender expression, how race, color, religion, different power structures are contributing to human rights violations. Even when states has best intentions to provide and recognize gender identity, gender expression in a human rights framework, and recognizing third gender as a recognized gender, for example, in India, Pakistan, in Bangladesh, when it comes to affirmative actions, for example, people has to show that they are castrated, so they fulfill the category of trans, of hijras or other third gender categories. So trans men and trans women has very little claim to claim their human rights. So it also shows, even when there is the intention that a lack of understanding of a comprehensive understanding of gender expression. And my last point is participation. And my last point is participation when it's very often an afterthought in many UN documents, in many UN processes. It's still an incredible visible lack of meaningful participation, how much transgender people are not participating in research design when it's about transgender people, in policy development, in any other development processes. Usually there is one or two trans person, if we are lucky in the room, who cannot represent the variety and intersectionality of societal and other kind of complex understanding how gender, how human rights in relation to gender expression and gender identity plays out around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eszter, for that very comprehensive overview on how gender identity and expression plays out in the HIV space and in the sexual and reproductive rights space and in different UN agencies. I really like this idea of a comprehensive understanding of gender, where we think about gender identity issues not just in terms of identity, but in terms of how it plays out on different bodies, because trans bodies are mixed bodies, as is commonly understood, and so, you know, one lens of a gender identity doesn't necessarily apply to the entire experience of each individual trans body, and each trans body also varies, just like each intersex body varies. And also thank you for talking about the different dynamics between gender identity and expression issues and race, culture, and religion. And I think this is a very good introduction to bring in Sheriff to talk about their work in the Southern African region and on regional coordination.
Thank you very much, and I'm very honored to be part of this panel. I'll touch more on the work that's been done in the Southern Africa region in terms of advocacy on transgender issues. And the presentation is not very much formal, but I'll touch more on what Eszter has touched, probably to share how the challenges are on the ground in relation to how, as transgender individuals, experience human rights violations on a daily basis, and a few cases will be cited. So it will also be important to give a little background of the law in Southern Africa, where we only have, amongst the Southern African countries, we only have South Africa, Lesotho, Mozambique, and Seychelles. In all other countries in Southern Africa where homosexuality is illegal, either expressly or indicated in the penal code or according to common law. Although these laws focuses specifically on sexual orientation, these laws often apply, or more correctly, applied to trans diverse people. Not only do policy and lawmakers fail to differentiate between sexual orientation and gender identity, the literature revising it tends to perpetuate the understanding that laws criminalizing same-sex sexuality, activity, and marriages also criminalize the transgender community. There has been also a quite wide amount of research around health in relation to trans community in Southern Africa, but lack of legal recognition, as Eszter has touched on, makes it difficult to access either citizenship status amongst the transgender community, which builds enormous obstacles for trans people's access to trans-specific health care. And this includes mental health. We're talking about HIV-related health care, access to medical procedures that relate to hormonal therapy and gender-affirming surgeries, amongst others. And there's examples more that we are going to touch on are a clear indication of lack of attention on transgender issues within the UN instruments and mechanisms. And there was a famous case in 2009, the Malawian famous case, which we might want to cite, of a trans woman who, with her fiancé, were convicted of acts of gross indecency. And the same experiences are endured by the trans community, and little or nothing is done to ensure protection of the trans community against violence. This responds to the issue where we are saying the homosexuality laws that exist in Southern Africa, in Southern African countries, still apply to transgender community in terms of differentiating issues between sexual orientation and gender identity. And there isn't much being done in terms of protection of transgender diverse community rights. There's also a recent case in Zambia which happened this year in 2016, where a trans woman was charged with cheating a man who took her from the bar with the belief that she's a female. And the two engaged in a fight, and the transgender woman was arrested and charged with assault. However, the police said that when they saw how the trans woman was dressed, they also decided that they should charge her of cheating, which means we are still, as the transgender community, being charged under the sexual orientation laws, which is homosexuality, which has got nothing to do with gender identity or gender expression. The cases themselves highlighted the arbitrary and unlawful nature of the harassment that many transgender people face, and how their constitutional rights and dignity, the right to be free from degrading treatment, and their right to equality are being violated. So despite protections under international law, many transgender people feel let down by the health systems in their countries. Whether it is a private or public health facility, we face transphobic attitudes from doctors and nurses who cannot understand the difference between gender identity and gender expression or sexual orientation itself, and often do not have the knowledge and facilities to provide us with proper health care and advice. And this brings a case where you would find most transgender people rather avoid getting treatment than enduring humiliation and invasion of their privacy. So the transgender community is vulnerable to HIV and AIDS, and yet we are being ignored in programs to combat the disease. We are talking about issues of discrimination whereby people are being excluded and forced into areas of sex work, and yet nothing is being done to respond to issues of HIV and AIDS amongst trans community. South Africa is the only country in Southern Africa that offers the most accessible transition treatment with hormone therapy, but it's very expensive for people who are not citizens to South Africa, because they cannot access it at public hospitals. It means they have to go to private hospitals, which makes it very expensive and inaccessible to the transgender community. And much as there are services in South Africa, gender reassignment is also still a challenge to even the citizens of South Africa, whereby the waiting list is for like 20 years before you can access the surgery. There's a long way to go before the transgender community can overcome the discrimination that most face every day, unless the implementation of the UN mechanisms are strengthened at member states in every country, especially in Southern Africa. The United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights found that other status, which appears in most constitutions in Southern Africa, where we talk about non-discrimination on the basis of sex and gender, there is also that clause that says, and other status. In the Constitution, the constitutions themselves do not specifically talk about sexual orientation or gender identity, but it has also been found that it cannot be a ground for discrimination. And the High Commissioner of Human Rights stated that the obligations of state to prevent violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity was denied from various international human rights instruments, and these include the ICCPR and the Universal Declaration. So in consideration the international legal principles, it is clear that gender identity is a prohibited ground of discrimination under international law, though its enforcement is not visible among the transdiverse community. The inability to change gender markers in official identity documents often has serious consequences. This takes us back to legal recognition of gender identity amongst different countries and even amongst the UN mechanisms. The transgender community usually face harassment by officials or even get arrested because of their identity documents, which do not match their physical appearance. With these examples and others, which I believe it's some of those things that we hear almost every day, the trans community in Southern Africa has decided to work on a movement whereby they can have a joint advocacy strategy to advance trans individual rights in Southern Africa, whereby we are also focusing on research issues, whereby you'd find not much is being done to prevent human rights because people rely on the issues that there's no research, there's no data. So we have decided as the Southern Africa Trans Forum to work on specific research on transgender issues. And as the Southern Africa region, we are putting our hope in the special rapporteur, the UN special rapporteur, maybe, to advance transgender rights on a daily basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheriff, for giving us those very concrete examples of what's happening in the Southern African region, and also how legal gender recognition intersects with so many other human rights violations, which I think is very crucial because often when trans activists approach the legal gender recognition argument, you know, the question is what does it relate to? But it certainly relates to a lot of other rights that trans people have denied. And it's also really great to hear about the work of the Southern African Trans Forum, and I think this relates nicely back to what Eszter was saying about research. You know, these are there's a coalition of different trans organizations who have decided that, you know, there is a gap in what's needed in terms of output for the region, and also, you know, finding solutions to that, which is to produce the research from the region, which I think is a fantastic initiative. I'll now we'll move on to Mauro Cabral, who will be our last speaker for the afternoon, and then we will move on to an open floor of questions. Mauro.
Thank you very much, everyone. 10 years ago, when the Yogyakarta Principles were produced, under Chapter 18, Protection Against Medical Abuses, there was introduced in the chapeau of the principle a declaration that says that no person may be forced to undergo any form of medical or psychological treatment, procedure, testing, or to be confined to a medical facility based on the sexual orientation or gender identity. And then, in the second part of that paragraph, it says, notwithstanding any classification to the contrary, a person's sexual orientation and gender identity are not, in and of themselves, medical conditions and are not to be treated, cured, or suppressed. Maybe it's a strange declaration in the sense that it introduced from the very beginning a clear contradiction between the first part of the sentence, referring to any classification to the contrary, and the clear expression in terms of human rights saying that sexual orientation and gender identities are not pathologies. So it doesn't say the word pathology, and actually, when the Yogyakarta principles were elaborated 10 years ago, pathologization was not related, it was not a common word in human rights language. So if you don't use very much these words, there is a very simple definition that said basically that pathologization is a biopolitical process in which a physical or mental trait, a habit, a practice, a way of life, an individual, a population, or even large groups of persons, like, for example, a particular ethnic group, are defined as sick in comparison with other traits, habits, practices, way of lives, individuals, populations, and group of persons defined as healthy. So it seems something very simple, but it has an extraordinary impact, a negative impact on the life of trans people. So the effects of pathologization reach far beyond the mere classification, the division of people between, healthy or sick. This classification entails a deep social approval of what is considered to be healthy and an equally strong devaluation of what is considered to be sick, usually enforced by states through laws, policies, and protocols. So these are some just 4 different examples, what has to do with intersex children when their bodies are pathologized and then can be surgically modified without their consent. What happened with gay and lesbian people when they are pathologized? For example, the families can confine them in institutions to treat their sexual orientation through aversion therapies. What happened with fat people? That because their bodies are pathologized, they can be stigmatized, ridiculized, and attacked in the media. And what happened with trans people? That are denied constantly the right to make informed decisions about their own bodies if those decisions have not been approved by mental health providers. So in the case of trans people, and we are going to see that these have different consequences, what we can say from the very beginning is that pathologization implies a serious case of heteronomy, which means that other people, in this case, the people in case of making a diagnosis, have the decision power in terms of sexual and reproductive health. From a trans perspective, pathologization plays a key role in the reproduction of state-sanctioned human rights violations against trans people by defining them as individuals whose very nature is pathological, and therefore whose autonomy and self-determination, bodily integrity, sexual and reproductive rights, right to identity and privacy, and access to healthcare are less valuable or not valued at all when compared with those of cis people. And I know that I'm introducing here another word that is not very common in this particular setting, which is cis. For trans people, cis peoples are those that are not trans. So a very interesting imbalance or silence in the gender perspective at the UN is this idea that gender is referred to women and men, and then we have this other population called trans people. This distinction that is produced through pathologization, but also through other mechanisms, including human rights mechanisms, creates, reinforces, and justifies gendered hierarchical distinctions, for example, between cis women and trans women, and cis men and trans men, with a tremendously negative impact on trans people's human rights. And if you never heard the word cis women, it's exactly because of that. Because women and men who are not trans are supposed to be the universal standard for womanhood and manhood, and trans people are just a particular case of those standards. So when we think in terms of how this impacts trans people's human rights, and this is a very short reference that goes only to access to 2 particular human rights. When it comes to be about access to legal recognition, it means that there are a series of requirements that trans people have to fulfill, including mental health diagnosis, which is gender identity disorder, gender dysphoria in DSM-5, or gender incongruence in the proposed new version of the International Classification of Diseases, sterilization, gender reassignment surgery, hormonal treatment, and in some cases, divorce. When it comes to be about access to gender-affirming procedures, it means that it's necessary, again, a mental health diagnosis, And in both cases, I put exclusion because when a diagnosis is necessary to have access to human rights, it means that if you're not able to get a diagnosis, not only if you refuse to have the diagnosis, but if you fail to get a diagnosis, it means that you are excluded from the enjoyment of these two key human rights. So if we go, for example, to the requirement of getting a diagnosis of gender identity disorder, I don't know if you know the definition, I just put it to share it. Basically, according to this definition, a trans people, like me, for example, is defined by the desire to live and being accepted as a member of the opposite sex, usually accompanied by a sense of discomfort with, or I don't know how to pronounce this in English, inappropriateness of one's anatomic sex, and a wish to have surgery and hormonal treatment to make one's body as congruent as possible with one's preferred sex. So if we start with the definition, and I always say the same because I'm always surprised by that, it starts with pathologizing the desire to live and be accepted as the member of the sex that you recognize as your own. If we go to the new definition proposed by the World Health Organization for the ICD-11, gender identity disorder is replaced by a new definition called gender incongruence, defined as the marked and persistent incongruence between an individual experienced gender and the assigned sex. The World Health Organization is not provided a clear indication of where the concept of incongruence is coming from to replace the identity disorder, but according to the Merriam-Webster English Dictionary, incongruence is related to incongruity, incongruity to the quality of state of it incongruous. Incongruous is strange because of not agreeing with what is usual or expected. Basically, in a world where in gendered terms people are expected to be cis men and women, trans people are, for example, trans men or women, or defining themselves with other identities. So what we are seeing is that in terms, and even contradicting that call of the Yogyakarta principles 10 years ago, current classifications and future classifications still put trans people in a very diminished place when it comes to be, when they go to be compared with cis men and women. There are some pro-pathologization rationales being discussed at this moment. And I included these that could be grouped into a general label of, rationales connected with eugenics rationales, considering that being trans is a pathology in fact, and then it's necessary, to have a diagnosis to treat affected individuals, to protect individuals against pathological demands, for example, mutilations, and then for them to regret these demands, to protect society from pathological individuals, and this is very important, for limiting or eliminating the reproduction of pathological traits, for example, through making serialization a legal requirement. But then we have other very interesting rationales, and they are interesting because they combine two key issues being discussed right now around the world. One that could be considered like a paternalistic approach to trans access to healthcare has to do with access, the very access to gender-affirming procedures in the way of getting the authorization from a medical provider in order to proceed to a surgical procedure or an hormonal treatment. In this case, the answer of the trans movement is informed consent, in the sense that if other individuals, including cis men and women, are able to provide informed consent for accessing complex practices, a depathologized version of trans people should be able to provide the same informed consent for the same kind of practices. The second issue is even more complicated and, from my perspective, more interesting, which is access to healthcare coverage and reimbursement under public and private healthcare systems. And especially in the case of private healthcare systems, that is an issue because what different advocates, and including the World Health Organization, is saying is that the only way in which trans-related healthcare could be covered is using a diagnosis. So if we see an expression of that rationale, for example, in an article published this year, It is said that even in countries that recognize the need for transgender-related healthcare services with availability of relevant expertise, private and public insurers often do not offer or might specifically exclude coverage for these services, essentially defining it as a social phenomenon. I mean, being trans, is likely to reduce coverage of related health services and discourage efforts to provide and necessitate appropriate training of health professionals. Basically, we are being pathologized as a matter of dealing with coverage of healthcare needs. The answer of trans activists to this rationale is basically human rights. We are being defined as mentally disordered people or people suffering from gender incongruence because that's the only way of getting coverage for healthcare needs, then it's necessary to review access to healthcare through a human rights lens, because it's not possible for us to keep justifying the pathologization of trans people and the human rights violations associated with it using an economic rationale. So what you are reading there is a letter sent by the group of, produced by a group of activists and sent to the Lancet Psychiatry, saying basically that we maintain that access to transitional healthcare, which is trans-specific healthcare, must be granted on human rights standards, and we call health providers and researchers to join or struggle against the naturalization of corporative psychomedicine. Contingent coverage limitations must not justify human rights violations, but be challenged by human rights arguments. The gender identity laws approved in Argentina in 2012 and Malta in 2015 prove that access to transitional healthcare based on human rights is not only desirable, but also possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the last intervention, Mauro, and I think it very nicely wraps up through the lens of pathologization and the work at the ICD, a lot of the issues that we have started to touch on by the other panelists. Just the concept of the control of trans bodies through the pathologization process is so interesting, and I think, to me it points to a general panic of the health professionals as well as the insurance providers of not being able to contain trans people and needing to still contain trans people, and then using the argument of access to insurance and access to healthcare systems as a justification, which of course is a very weak one, but to me it speaks of the panic when they realize that there is a population that is seeking self-autonomy and self-definition, which is essentially what trans activists are looking for. So I will now open the panel, open up to the floor for any questions to any of the panelists, individually or as a group.